Welcome to the second lecture for Chapter 3 on communication and the self. As I mentioned in the last lecture, in this presentation we will be learning about self-disclosure. So at the end of the last lecture we talked a little bit about the awareness and management of the self, and that's really going to be the heart of what we are talking about today when we talk about self-disclosure. So self-disclosure is the act of intentionally giving other people information about yourself that you believe to be true and that you think that they don't already have. And so this relates to our concept of the self and the identity, because it is through self-disclosure that we are giving other people that information. So when we go back to the Johari window and we think about that open area, or the known self, that is really self-disclosure is one way that we put the information out there for others to know about us. So it's essentially how we communicate aspects of ourselves to others. And there are two really important key things here to really think about, is that self-disclosure is only occurring when you are communicating information that you believe to be true about yourself. So if you're communicating, kind of over exaggerating, or you're giving falsehoods, that would not be classified as self-disclosure. And you have to presume that the other person doesn't already have that information. So if you came to me and you told me that you were a student in my class, at this point I already know that. So that wouldn't be self-disclosure about yourself. It would be a different kind of communication. So when we think about self-disclosure, we're really thinking about information that's truthful and information that is new or about yourself, or that you think is new for the other person. Self-disclosure can range from really personal information to pretty mundane information. So when we think about the mundane kinds of self-disclosure, we can refer to kind of that small talk interaction. When we first meet somebody, we tell them our name, where we're from, where we go to school, so that would be classified as self-disclosure. And we also, when we provide kind of the most intimate pieces of our self-concept to others, that is also a more intimate type of disclosure about ourselves. There are some key characteristics about self-disclosure that your chapter talked about, and it's important to think about as we begin to understand self-disclosure as a concept. The first is that self-disclosure is intentional and it's truthful. So for a communication act to qualify as self-disclosure, it has to be information that is deliberately shared with other people. And again, going back to that definition, information that we believe to be true about ourselves. Self-disclosure varies in breadth and depth. So as we think about breadth being kind of the range of topics that we talk about, so when we first meet people, we might have a fairly limited breadth. We don't talk about a lot of things. Maybe if you met somebody in class, you would talk about class things. If it's like this class, you might talk about some surface level relationship type things. But you may not, unless you begin to foster that relationship outside of class, you may not talk about some of those inner aspects of yourself, or maybe even talk about other areas of interest or other classes that you're interested in. So your breadth of topics may be fairly small when you first meet somebody. But as you begin to know them and develop a relationship with them, the range of topics is likely going to increase. As the relationship begins to continue and grow, you also are likely to increase the depth of topics. So the depth of a self-disclosure is essentially how personable or how personal or intimate the information is about yourself. And so when we think about breadth, we're thinking about kind of the number or range of topics that you talk about yourself to other people. And when we think about depth, we're really talking about like how deep or how intimate or personal is that information to you. Telling somebody your height or telling them likely where you go to school is not going to be a tapping into the depth. Telling perhaps your biggest fear or your most embarrassing moment, those things may provide some greater depth into your self-disclosures. So again, sorry, I got ahead of myself here. So breadth of disclosure is the range of topics we discuss with other people, and depth is how personal, intimate that information is. Self-disclosure also varies among relationships. So not all relationships are characterized by the same types of self-disclosures. Again, when you first meet somebody or they're just an acquaintance, you are likely going to have very little breadth and depth in your discussions. You maybe will talk about just one topic, a shared interest that you have, maybe what brought you together. But as that relationship develops, your breadth and depth of disclosure is going to change. Similarly, the types of relationships that you have, the breadth and depth may look different. So the things that you talk about, the breadth of certain topics may be different within different relationships. So even though maybe you're really close with your parents, and you maybe talk about a romantic partner that you have, you may talk about things that you do and how you kind of feel about them. You likely, maybe you do, I don't know, but it's uncharacteristic to talk about maybe some like more intimate kind of sexual disclosures about your relationship with your parents. So that range would be a little bit different, the depth would be a little bit different about your relationship, whereas maybe with your friends and likely with your romantic partner, you would have a different kind of breadth and depth. So the type of relationship is also really important. Even though your relationship with your parent and your romantic partner and your friends are, may have the highest levels of closeness in all those relationships, the things that you talk about and you share about yourself are going to be different because those relationships are characterized by different things. We also know that self-disclosure is usually reciprocal. So when we share information about ourselves, we generally follow the norm of reciprocity, the expectation that we want others then to return that self-disclosure. When I ask my husband how his day was and he tells me all about his day, he generally, as there's this expectation of reciprocity that he's then going to ask me about my day and I'm going to share that information. And so we know that there is this kind of expectation in our close relationships that when we share something, we expect the other person to also share in some level. So it doesn't have to be an exact match, but you do kind of, it's this idea of back and forth here, and that happens when we share information about ourselves as well. Self-disclosure can serve many purposes. We talk a lot about how self-disclosure is important for building relationships in this class. Self-disclosure can be important for sharing valuable information about yourself. So one of my areas of interest is how we communicate mental health diagnoses to our close others. And I've done some research looking at these kinds of disclosures among college students. And one of the reasons for disclosing this information to people like their roommate is because students say this is a really valuable, this is an important piece of information that if I go into, I begin to be symptomatic, then that my roommate, the person who lives with me, really needs to know that information. So even at the offset of these relationships, when they're not quite close yet, they're still sharing this very personal information because of that goal, that that purpose, that it's really important information about me in case something happens. We also know that self-disclosure is important for kind of easing tension in relationships. You might, if there is a kind of tense interaction, you might share, maybe an embarrassing moment or a little tidbit about yourself to kind of ease that tension. When we're like on a first date, that kind of anxiety can be eased by sharing information, and especially when we have the rule of reciprocity being followed, right? So you share something, the other person shares something, we begin to ease that kind of tension that can exist in those first interactions. Self-disclosure is greatly influenced by culture and gender, so thinking about many of the things we talked about in Chapter 2. Again, women on average tend to disclose more about themselves at the beginning of relationships than men do. And finally, self-disclosure is a gradual process. So like I said, for varying among relationships. As your closeness with somebody develops over time, people get to know each other better. They're going to reveal more information about themselves. And so as we think about self-disclosure as a gradual process, we begin to think, we can look back to your 36 questions activity. And in a moment, we're going to talk and relate this to the theory of social penetration. So what I want you to do now, hopefully I instructed you to complete the 36 questions activity at the end of the last lecture. The notes for this lecture said that you needed to have that completed activity to engage in the interactions for this lecture. And so what we're going to do first is I really want you to get out your completed worksheet and think about the questions that I asked you, the first two questions. So how did this activity make you feel? Did you like it? Did you hate it? And some of that might depend on the type of relationship that you have with the person you completed it with. Was this a close relationship before the activity? Was it a romantic relationship? Was it just an acquaintance? And I want you to talk a little bit about that right now, but before we get into our application of the social penetration theory. So go ahead in the discussion box and play pause it, complete this, this discussion activity, interaction. And after you've shared your feelings about the activity, answering these few questions, I want you to interact with your peers. Respond to at least one of your peers by noting either the similarities in your experiences or the differences. And here you might think specifically about how the relationship type is similar or different. Okay, so the most important, probably the most well-used, widely known theory related to self-disclosure is the social penetration theory, and this really helps us understand that those concepts of breadth and depth that I noted earlier. So the social penetration theory explains the differences in communication in relation to breadth and depth. And so as we know that as relationships begin and continue or grow, the self-disclosure tends to increase and deepen. So we begin to see larger breadth and larger depth. So the beginning of relationships oftentimes marked by small talk, really sharing aspects of kind of our public persona, information that could be easily achieved through looking at us or, Googling our name. But as relationships continue and develop and become closer, we begin to share more intimate details about ourselves. We're sharing that kind of inner layer of information. The social penetration theory uses a metaphor of the onion to really understand the dynamics of breadth and depth in disclosure as relationships developed. And so the theorists who use and developed the social penetration theory really described the process of self-disclosure in relationship development, like peeling back the layers of an onion, where when we are, kind of the outside of the onion is the breadth of information. So when we kind of meet somebody, we start at one end, maybe one point, sharing really public information, and as we begin to know them better, we move around this kind of circumference of the onion, sharing, maybe our tastes, maybe information about our kind of interests, maybe sharing some information about other relationships. So we increase the breadth of disclosure, the topics that we talk about. But also as our closeness and our relationships increase, we peel the layers of the onion off to get to the inner layers of the onion, which really represent that deep level of depth in our self-disclosure. So the outer layer of the onion represents kind of superficial information about ourselves, physical appearance, our major, information that's easily kind of retrieved through pretty basic like research about a person. But the inner layers really represent that more intimate information, a person's thoughts, their feelings, their fears, their concept of self, really. And so the core of the onion would be our the whole pieces of our identity. And as we peel back the layers of the onion, as we get to know people, we increase our breadth and we increase our depth of disclosure. The social penetration theory says that this process of peeling back the onion and engaging in self-disclosure happens in 3 stages as a relationship develops. So the first stage of the social penetration theory focuses on this orientation, this coming together, getting to know somebody, exchanging that non-intimate information, interactions that really adhere to social norms. So not really thinking about those when you first meet somebody for the first time, what kinds of information are you sharing? You may think about, sitting in class that first day, what did you share when you go to class on the first day and the instructor asks you to share information about yourself, right? There's very minimal breadth. There is no depth in these kinds of disclosures generally. There are some interesting phenomenon like the stranger on the plane phenomenon where, you meet somebody for the first time and they share everything about themselves, but for the most part, the norm for self-disclosure at the orientation stage is to start by really exchanging kind of non-intimate information. Very little breadth, no depth in our disclosure. When we like that first interaction, we want to continue the relationship, we move into the exploratory affective stage where individuals begin to reveal a little bit more about themselves. So here we really see an increase in breadth, but we are not sharing personal information, deeply personal information. So no depth here either. Really thinking about maybe casual friendships, maybe as you get to know somebody, maybe in a class you did a lot of like partner work and you get to know your partner a little bit better. You sit next to each other in class all the time. You may begin to share some of that other kinds of information. Oftentimes I hear students in class, share kind of where they're from, and that gets them to talking about how they have mutual friends. Maybe they played each other in school if they were on athletic teams, and so they begin to share a little bit more information. We begin to see a little bit more breadth, but not a whole lot of depth here in this stage. As relationships begin to develop, they move from casual friendship to more stable friendship, or maybe we're beginning to start a romantic relationship. We would begin to move into the affective stage. And so we begin to continue to see an increase of breadth, but really in this stage is when our depth begins to increase. So people begin to share and disclose, a little bit of personal and private information. So this is really where we see the spike, the beginnings of sharing that deep pieces of our self-concept with others. We're really expecting a lot of reciprocity here in this stage, right? So if I'm sharing really private personal information, I'm hoping to get something in return from the other person, so I don't feel like I've overshared. And again, this is really characteristic of budding like romantic relationships, or friendships that are moving into a more kind of stable stage. When we think about the fourth stage of the social penetration theory, we know that this is the stable stage. So we have lots of breadth, lots of depth in these interactions. The stable stage is really reserved for close personal friends and romantic, developed romantic relationships. Family relationships are often in this stable stage, and where communicators share lots of information. They're open, they're comfortable with each other, they can kind of predict how the other person is going to respond. So again, we have lots of depth and breadth here in these interactions. But in our lives, we know that we can reach the stable stage, but that doesn't mean that the relationship is going to stay there. So we have friendships that wane, we have romantic relationships that end, and those would be characterized by the depenetration stage. So when one or both communicators perceive that the cost of self-disclosure outweighs its benefits, and the individuals begin to withdraw from that self-disclosure. So we see a decrease in breadth, a decrease in depth. We are limiting the kinds of information that we share about ourselves. An example of this could be in a friendship. Maybe you shared something really personal about yourself, and that friend shared it with other people. Maybe posted it on social media, maybe told somebody that they weren't supposed to tell. They violated your trust in some way. And then your reaction to that could be, that person is no longer trusted. So I'm not going to share with them anymore. I'm not going to share with them the private information about myself because they violated my trust in that way. So what we are going to do now, the last thing that we're going to do in this lecture, is I want you to pull back out your 36 questions activity, and I want you to apply the social penetration theory to your experience. So how did this activity relate to the social penetration theory? What stages did you experience? How did those stages change perhaps as you moved through the 36 questions with your partner? So I want you to think about and to analyze for me, how did the 36 questions activity relate to this social penetration theory and the stages that we just talked about?